All right, hi everybody. I'm going to get started and then we'll get you all out of here. So, everybody see what I see? Great. This talk came out of a Twitter conversation between Eric and I where I said, I'm trying to figure out how to make a library work with my application and it's built using Browserify and it's a nightmare and so I don't understand, help me. And Eric said, hey, would you want to present this at MadJS? So just to preface, I don't know anything about what I'm talking about, but this was my experience and out of it came a little bit of information about how the JavaScript bundle ecosystem, it kind of works. And if you feel like you need to use Browserify, there are some pluses to Browserify. If you feel like you need to use it, then some things to keep in mind if you're building a library or interested in using it to build a library. I am Ethan Jewett. You can find me on Twitter or GitHub using that username. I've been in Madison for a couple of years. I do work on SAP ecosystem stuff, a lot of data visualization and data management. I also do work on browser-based, general-purpose browser-based data visualization and browser-based data management frameworks like Crossfilter. But yeah, we're going to talk about Browserify. So again, this is really focused a little bit more on the use case of Browserify if you're trying to build and distribute a library that other people are going to use. Browserify was originally built kind of for the use case of an application, so somebody who's not building a library, who's consuming libraries. So there are a lot of tools for doing that, and the situation if you're building a library is a little bit different. So what I would say is, first of all, probably don't use it, but a lot of people want to use it. I use it for a library I built, and if you do feel you need to do that, I think I have a couple of tips around doing it well. So Browserify has some distinct advantages. It makes it so that require works. So basically, it's like you can build a Node.js library more or less, and Browserify will make it just run in the browser. So require pretty much just works. It's really easy to use existing Node modules. It gives you lots of flexibility. There are tons of different options and transformations that Browserify provides so that you can pull in other modules and libraries that are written using other definitions. So Node uses CommonJS, but like if you want to pull in an AMD library, no problem. If you want to pull in a library in the global namespace, great, you can do that. There are transformations that will wrap those things. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. It works great if you're, the way I usually think of it is at the top of the dependency graph. So if you're building an application that is just consuming a lot of stuff, and you need to manage that. So some problems are that, well, the same thing, basically. It depends on using require to bundle up all your dependencies. Just look suspiciously at the HDMI cable. So it does have this assumption that you're going to bundle everything if you're using Browserify, because that's what you do for an app. So it's kind of all or nothing. You can bundle everything, you can bundle nothing. You can pick and choose what you want to bundle, but it's hard further on down the line to override those decisions if a library author makes them. So you have to make those decisions somewhat carefully. And things get very complicated in the situation where there are upstream projects that depend on you. So I would say, yeah, it gets complicated. So what are some of those complications? Well, projects that depend on you, like the project I am working on, may be using Browserify. We aren't. They might be pure Node.js. They might be purely client-side, using something like Bower as their package manager, which is the situation we were in. So we were trying to use a library that was set up using and bundled using Browserify, but we weren't using Browserify. So that made it even more difficult to override some of the decisions that the library author had made. And you may want to use CDNs for specific libraries. So the particular situation we had is the application I was building pulls in both jQuery and CodeMirror and uses those as part of the application. So we pulled in an external library specifically to use to do Sparkle queries, which is the RDF-based query language. And that library actually bundled jQuery and CodeMirror in it. And so that library was about 1 megabyte in size, minified, and the two biggest pieces of it were jQuery and CodeMirror, which we already had in our application because we needed them. So why were those in there? Well, it was because Browserify by default just bundles everything, and so that's what this library had done. It was the easiest thing to do. So I submitted an issue on GitHub and said, hey, could we maybe try to split some of this stuff out? And the guy who was working on the library was very helpful and said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So I said, all right, I'll try to do it and get back to you. And so began the tweets. It was extremely complicated and difficult. This was a pretty big library, a pretty complex library, so refactoring the build system was a little bit iffy, but it seemed like it was a little harder than it needed to be. So I think if, in the interest of keeping things simple, I kind of created a very simple example that we'll go through. But in general, that's the issue. So package management systems gave me a major headache. One of my favorite tweets during that month was this one. Package managers all the way down. Yeah. So Bower is kind of the hotness right now. It's a package manager that's based on NPM, sort of. Not really, but you install it using NPM. So the difference between Bower and most of you are probably familiar with NPM and the way that works. Bower actually mostly just pulls in packages that are sort of sit on the global namespace, and then all you do is basically concat everything that comes in through Bower. So if you're using Gulp, there's a Gulp plugin to do that, but Grunt has plugins as well. It keeps things pretty simple and pretty easy to reason about, but Browserify is a little more involved in that. It really basically follows the way that NPM and Node works with the require statement. So let's talk about complications. There are some options if you're building a library and you want to figure out how to bundle it up and provide it to people to use, and you're using Browserify. So what most libraries will do in the Node ecosystem is they don't bundle any of their dependencies. In your package.json, you define what your dependencies are and what the versions need to be, and then it's up to people who are using your library to pull in those dependencies when they use it. And Node basically handles that. If you use a library that has a dependency that you haven't, and you forget to run npm install, then you get an error when you run your application. And it's pretty obvious what the error is. It's that you don't have a library available. So one option is just to do that, basically, and kind of just not really use Browserify. Just use a standard build. And that works great if you're using Browserify in the end, in the application that's trying to consume the library. It works great if you're using Node.js. It doesn't work so well if you're using kind of a vanilla, if you're just trying to import this library into the browser, or if you're using Bower. So then you have to manually remember to pull in all the dependencies. Not the worst thing in the world, but not great either. If you define a bower.json file, that solves that problem for Bower. But the browser people are still kind of out of luck a little bit. So the other option is to bundle everything, which works everywhere, but not in a very nice way. You get what I just talked about, where you have a pretty enormous library file, and there's a lot of duplication of libraries that are actually bundled in that file. So another option is that Browserify, and I'll show a little example of this, has this statement called exclude, which is sort of the opposite of require. But basically, when you're building a Browserify bundle, you can either, if there are requires, like for example, require jQuery in your library, you can say exclude jQuery, and it won't bundle jQuery into that bundle. All the require jQueries will still be there, and they won't be going anywhere, so your application won't work. But jQuery won't be in the bundle. So then what you can do is create another bundle that you also insert into the page before you try to load your library that includes jQuery or whatever other libraries you want in the Browserify format, and everything will work. Doesn't really solve the problem. So that's not a great option, and it totally doesn't work with Bower or with a vanilla browser environment, because you have to have this Browserify bundle that exposes the necessary modules. So another option is to use this Browserify shim plugin for Browserify. And what that does, and I'll show an example of that as well, is it looks for any require statements of a particular type. So what you say is like shim jQuery and use the global jQuery instead. So it will go through all your code and look for require jQuery, and it will cut it out and replace it with like window.jQuery, more or less. It's a little bit more involved than that, but that's pretty much what it does. So it just says use the global object. So that works for the browser environment, but it totally doesn't work for the Node environment, because there is no global jQuery object. In Node, you have to require it in order to use it. So we're out of luck there. So where we end up is you have to actually do two different builds, and I'll show you what that entails. So what I've put together is just a really quick, really easy, simple example library. Can you see that up there, sort of? Yeah. So what we've got is two projects, one of which is our example application, and it requires this example library. These are on GitHub. I mean, they're not very complicated, but they're on GitHub. So we've got a main.js. We require the dependency, and all the dependency is a function that returns this. This is a dependency statement. So of course in the package.json we have to define our dependencies. This just reaches out to a GitHub repository directly. And all that happens here is that we've got a web page. We just load in that main. We just load in this file example.js. So this has been browserified, and what we're doing here is we've got a first line that sets up the Browserify environment, more or less. It makes the requires work, and then we require this dependency, and then all of the things that are being required show up down here. There's a hash of all the dependencies. So this one's pretty small, but if we include a jQuery, then like jQuery would show up here. It would say jQuery, and then this would be all of jQuery. Okay, so that would be our bundle. So the end result is the require works, dependency becomes the dependency, and in the browser we can go ahead and do, I'm just using function encapsulation because, but that's our example. So, sorry, I should just say really quickly, we're actually exposing, in our Browserify build function, build step, we're exposing it as a standalone variable example on the global window object. So that's going to be where our application lives. You don't have to do that, but if you want to be able to access that from the window object, you have to do this. So that's our example, and then we can get at the dependency this way. Simple enough. So what happens if we make things a little more complicated? Let's just do, I think we're running, yeah, let's just go straight to the to build dependency. And I'll show you how it should end up. Which is pretty similar to what we just saw. Not two guilds, two builds. All right. So what we're going to look at here is our build file, our main file, the end result, and that's in our package files. So we'll do the same over here in the project with that has the dependency. All right, so what we're looking at as far as the main file is basically the same thing. It's almost exactly the same. I've added in a little require jQuery here because that's the problem we're kind of trying to avoid. And let's just run through what's going to happen here as far as the different examples that we have. So what we end up doing in the library file in the dependency is we end up having two build scripts. One of them builds everything with no dependencies, and it does that using a specific Browserify shim transformation. And this shim is actually defined in the package.json file down here, and all it does is it switches out jQuery, so require jQuery, for the jQuery global object. So we do that once, and we create this dependency.js file. So that has no bundled dependencies. It expects to find its bundled dependencies on the window object. We also build a version that does include jQuery. So we don't shim jQuery, and because we're using Browserify, it will then pull in the dependency. So this is the file that people who are running this just in the browser, vanilla, they just want it to work, will use. No one else will use that. This dependency.js file lives here, and you can see it's very small. It's exactly what it was without jQuery, except that we actually have this var jQuery equals window.jQuery. So that's what Browserify shim does. And this is the file that will be used by a Bower package manager or something like that. So we got that set up. The Bower.json has its main file defined as that dependency.js. So not source/main.js, because Bower won't know what to do with the require. It's defined as the dependency.js. It's already built, essentially. And then our main.js file is all set for Node applications to use or other Browserify-based applications to use. So in order to point applications the right way there, in our package.json, we just have the main file defined as source/main.js. Okay, so if you npm install this main file, for example, then it'll pull in that dependency, then it'll pull in that dependency properly. So that's what we end up with, and that's what I think I've kind of figured out that's probably the best way to structure these types of projects. Unfortunately, you do have to sort of have a double build step to support the bundled, like, vanilla browser version of your library. But the key is to really make sure that the key to avoiding pain, like the kind of pain that we ran into on this project where we had this huge library that we had to refactor, is that it needs to be a standard Node build script, essentially. Like, you have to be able to npm install, and it should just build itself. And part of the way to avoid that is not to automatically run this Browserify shim in the Node build step. So you can actually define here a Browserify transform in the package.json, and then that will always run when Browserify pulls in this library. But you don't actually want that to happen, because if our initial application here doesn't include jQuery, we need it. So we need to pull it in that case. And Browserify does a good job of identifying when both the application and its dependency require jQuery and only including it once. So that's great. So we want Browserify to handle that the same way Node handles that. So that's the end result. Hopefully that was somewhat clear. I have a somewhat more clear way to summarize this that I'll just hop back to. So what you want to do, just to reiterate, and again, please correct me if I'm completely wrong here, but this is the best way I found to do it. What you want to do is you want to have, whether you're using gulp or not, you want to have two build scripts, one which creates a file that has no dependencies, but looks for them essentially on the window object, another one that has all of its dependencies bundled, and then you want to point the bower.json at the dependency.js file with no dependencies. Not well named, sorry about that. And the package.json for Node should point at your main entry point. So your source/main.js file. So that's what I came out of this with. I don't know if anybody has any better ideas. I'd love to hear them, because this was what the whole Twitter conversation was about, and this is where I ended up. So yeah, that's about it. One piece of bonus content, which became available, I think 3 weeks ago, actually, with Browserify 6, and this is one thing that we were really struggling with this library, was that this library we were trying to fix had dependencies itself that did requires that were internal to the Node repository, or the NPM repository. So CodeMirror has plugins that have require statements that are like /lib/CodeMirror. So they actually self-reference within the CodeMirror bundle. And it was a complete mess because we couldn't shim those out using Browserify shim, because there's no way to apply transforms to dependencies of dependencies. That changed in Browserify 6. You can use the global true option on a transformation, and that transform will then apply to all dependencies down the dependency graph. So you can shim out require statements if you really want to in dependencies of dependencies. So it gives you a little more leverage over library authors who maybe don't structure things quite right. So yeah, that's about it. But thanks for listening. Ideas?
My
Comments?
was really, so you feel like you had to jump through these hoops because the author did not structure their application
in this case,
appropriate.
Yeah, in this case, the library wasn't structured appropriately, and it turns out that structuring a library appropriately to work with all of these options is difficult to do. It seems like whether you're using Browserify or not. I mean, if you're building a library now, you want to make it work with Node.js and Browserify. That should, those two, if it works in one, it should work in the other. But you also want to make it work in a vanilla browser environment. And if you have a ton of dependencies, like, I mean, the application I'm working on has about 20 different dependency libraries. We're not going to tell people using this library that they need to install each of those. We may be willing to tell them they need to use Bower, but we're not going to tell them they need to have like a script tag for each of the dependencies. And then you probably want to support Bower as well, because that's what a lot of people are using nowadays. So you need to support kind of both of those worlds, and it's a little bit difficult to do that without either having a huge file full of bundled dependencies or asking people to essentially do their own package management.
I actually ran into a similar situation with require.js from
the
library Raphael,
mm-hmm.
that they were doing concatenating
Yeah.
a library that said, you know, if require defined as unglobal, then make sure you use it.
Yep. Yeah, and Browserify kind of does that also. If there's a require defined on the global scope, it will use that require instead of using its internal version of require. So you kind of override that way as well, is my understanding. But
my solution for it was fork the repo.
That's essentially what I did for this. Yeah, that's essentially what I did for this library, and I fixed it in one way, and the library author came back and fixed it in a different way, which is totally fine. So it ended up everybody was more or less happy with things. Like there is still this issue around making the decision about what you bundle and what kind of distribution files you end up creating. And I kind of strongly have the opinion that you should create at least one distribution file that has nothing bundled into it, none of the dependencies bundled into it, so that at least your upstream users can make the decision about what they want to bundle in themselves, even if that's a little bit painful for them. And then sure, also make one that's completely bundled if you want to, so that people can use it immediately, if they don't care about file size.
I guess it really depends on the people or the users that you would expect to use your library.
Yeah.
What you think they're technical.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whether you need to create that completely bundled version depends on that for sure.
And you shouldn't have to. I mean, the point of Browserify to me is to make a small module that can work in Node and the browser.
Yeah.
I mean, bundling your CSS and your images, all that stuff in a Browserify bundle, I wouldn't suggest. But you know, for me, I really enjoy Browserify. I think it's doubled my output because I can write a small little library that does one thing really well, and it works in Node and it works in the browser.
Yeah.
And if I have another application, I can easily pull it in. I got one more step beforehand. But if you're, people use CoffeeScript all the time, right? So it's not that big of a deal to have an extra step, an extra build step.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's a shame that the library author was I think using this incorrectly. You should have been able to just swap out the jQuery that you're using because it would have been defined in the package JSON dependencies, and you just get your dependencies when you npm install.
Yeah, I mean, part of
that defeats the need for Bower, because what is Bower? Bower is just a front end to GitHub pull, right?
Yep. Well, npm is now too, apparently. But yeah, one point I did want to make is that Browserify works. It seems to me that it works great if everybody's using Browserify, but in our case, we aren't using Browserify in the consuming application. So we need a non-Browserify version essentially a standalone version of the app, which should work fine. Like you should be able to create that without any issues, but in this particular case, that wasn't happening. And I've seen that in a couple of other cases as well, where if you're using Browserify for a library, you just need to be careful to kind of turn off that functionality to pull everything in. But yeah. And there is actually a global option to do that, and I just forgot what it's called. I didn't write it down in the presentation, but there is a global option in Browserify to say don't pull in dependencies. So that's one way to do it as well, if you don't want to shim. So yeah, that's it.
I think it's a
presentation from a Twitter conversation.
It's a great reason for
a great reason for MS6 modules.
The purpose of it is we need some kind of official module system so we can stop doing this.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to fix the problem because it's more of a like just think about this stuff when you build your library type problem more than a which module system to use type problem. I think. I mean, you get the same type of problem with AMD. I think where you can in an AMD module you can bundle everything into it if you want. It's not a good idea, but people, you have to do it at the application level. You have to bundle everything in, right? Because you want to avoid having a billion kind of synchronous calls to load your libraries, and you just have to avoid doing that if you're building a library yourself. So, thank you.